Hello everyone, it is November 21st, 2023. It's Tuesday. It's Harp Tuesday. Welcome to this week's episode. So today it's just a bit of story time. I've just gotten back from my European tour. I had a wonderful time, but I didn't manage to do any Harp Tuesday episodes while I was away. So I'm going to try to do one every week for a little while now. If you haven't already, I just posted a video of one of the pieces from a performance from Germany, from part of that tour, so definitely check that out. And today, as I say, a little bit of story time. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about flying with a harp, my experiences with that, and my thoughts on that. So I sometimes get asked, because I do a bunch of travel, how do I travel with a harp? And actually, until last year, I'd never flown with a harp. Normally, when I go to perform, I'm performing on a pedal harp, and it's potentially actually literally impossible to take it with you on a plane. I was told years ago that the pedal harp in its big hard shell flight case is actually too big to go on a typical passenger plane. And I can believe that because it's actually a real challenge just to move it anywhere. You have to rent like a full-sized van to move it in the hard shell case. So the logistics and the hassle and the nightmare of that, I think would be just too much. So when I go to perform and I'm flying, I am using a harp at the locations where I'm playing. So either a harp is being provided or I'm renting a harp, and that's how it works. Just kind of like the same as if you play the piano. You don't fly with your piano, you play a piano at the location. So last year, they say I did fly with a harp because I bought this little Harp E in Europe and I took it with me on the plane back home to Canada. And that was, it was a little bit of uncertainty and stress because I wasn't sure. So this harp, I don't know if you can see, but there's a suitcase back there. And that suitcase it's just at the limit of a carry-on size. Depending on the airline, it might actually be a tiny bit too big. And yet you can see there's no way that this would fit any of these harps. So here's a Harp E, here's an even smaller Firefly 2, another little electric harp, and here's a harpsichord. None of them would fit the stated carry-on limits of any airline, as far as I know. I was flying home last year on Air Canada, and Air Canada has the best instrument policy that I have encountered, which says that you can bring a musical instrument as a carry-on, even if it's strictly bigger than the listed limits. And they specifically mention, as well as violins, they mention guitars. And this is definitely smaller, I think, than a guitar. So last year I was trying to figure out what should I do. And actually I thought about trying to put it in my luggage as a checked luggage, but actually to find a suitcase that would fit it is harder than you would think. With the dimensions of this are actually, it's quite challenging to find that big a suitcase. This one I think would be much more possible. And so in the end, I brought it as a carry-on. And with Air Canada, when you have a musical instrument, you're allowed to board early, along with families traveling with small children, anyone who needs extra assistance, including musicians with their instruments. So that guarantees you then that you will find some overhead bin space, which is always at a premium these days because almost all airlines are charging you to check baggage. And that worked out fine, so that was no problem. And so then for Europe this year, I wanted to bring it along to have a harp to practice on a little bit, keep the calluses in shape even though I couldn't practice the music I would be performing, to potentially record some harpists in the wild, and to be able to teach and have a harp to demonstrate on even if it wasn't a full-size harp. And so again, I traveled Air Canada, so I was kind of locked into traveling Air Canada then to bring it as a carry-on, at least that was my feeling. And I want to tell you about that first flight. So I flew from Victoria to Montreal, Montreal to Rome. And on that flight from Victoria to Montreal, it was crowded. It was a smaller aircraft than some of the others. And they were asking everyone to check their luggage. And so I was told, oh, you have to gate check this. It was early in the morning. I was like, oh. In retrospect, I wish I had fought a little bit harder, not fought in the sense of, you must let me do this, because no matter their policy, it is at the discretion of the people in charge at that moment. but to try to convince them this is a musical instrument. Is there any way I can take it on? It's delicate. Of course, if I were a violinist and this was my main instrument, expensive instrument, there was no way I would board unless I had that instrument with me. I would be prepared just not to take that flight. In this case, I did gate check it, and gate check is where, as you're going on the airplane, you leave in this case, the harp, but it could be strollers or something like that, at the gate, and they put them on, and presumably they're the last things loaded, and then you get them again at the gate or whatever as you come off the airplane. And so in theory, that's not too bad, and this is pretty sturdy, right? I mean, it traveled as a kit just in a cardboard box before it was made, and it doesn't have a soundboard in the same way that an acoustic instrument does. And even the lever system is I think, less delicate than, say, a typical lever system. And I felt I was willing to risk it. I mean, I wanted to take this flight. And anyway, yeah, so I let them gate check it. And then I had some more stress in Montreal because I was waiting for it, and I asked the agent at the gate, I had to gate check this, and she goes, "Oh yes, no, it'll be going on to Rome." And I was like, no, I didn't want it going through all the baggage, the luggage, conveyor belts, and everything like that. And eventually, 20 minutes later, 30 minutes later, they were able to send somebody down to check, and there was another person flying who was waiting for their stroller, who had a much tighter connection than I did. They sent somebody down to check. They found my harp, and I was reunited with it, and it seemed fine. There was Air Canada Rouge, which is like a more budget version of Air Canada. I don't know if that had any difference in terms of, I have to look up what maybe their policy is different. I don't know if there's a different policy, but anyway, that was stressful. But then the flight from Montreal to Rome, no problem. And then coming home, no problem on those flights as well. Again, these were large jets, 343 seating, some Boeing 777 or something like that. And what I would do, so I would board early, I would have an aisle seat, I would stake out some overhead bin space, it fits no problem. And then, because typically it was crowded, I would be on the lookout for people with slightly smaller roller bags to invite them to put them underneath the harp, because I knew that I would be, they would want, the flight attendants would want to maximize that space. So there was room to put like a small roller bag underneath the harp. Or in one case, I saw that the bin in front of mine was perfect. I could pop it in on top of those. And I'll pop a picture up so you can kind of see what that looks like. And that worked out, no problem. But again, an illustration, I think, of a little bit of the stress that is possible if you're trying to fly with your instrument. And, we've all read and seen, heard the horror stories, not just of harps, of guitars, of violins, of whatnot. In Europe, my plan was to take the train, which I love the train system in Europe. It's fantastic and no problem to be traveling with a small harp like this. In the end, I ended up having to make a flight from Germany to Croatia, and I ended up booking an extra seat for my harp. So this was on Ryanair, budget airline that was, I'm 100% sure they were not going to be interested in letting you take something that was bigger than stated carry-on as a carry-on. But you can buy a seat for your harp. Aha, Mr. Harp, here you go. And so then the advantage, of course, of all these budget airlines in Europe is often the price is quite low, and often the price is low, and then the cost of bringing any sort of luggage on is kind of expensive. But my harp travels very light. It had no luggage to bring on. So I think I paid $35 for that extra seat, which, great. And so it gets strapped in, right? They want to make sure they can securely, it's not just that it fits, but that it's securely strapped down. So if you were traveling, say, with a harp with a soundboard, you might want some sort of case, potentially, or some padding. And I'm not sure how big a harp you could bring as with just booking an extra seat. The distance here, was actually, I think, extended a tiny bit past the seat. And so to try and bring a 34-string harp, for example, could you fit that in a seat space and have it securely tied down? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. But for something like this, no problem. And again, the advantage then is there's nobody next to me. So it's a little bit, maybe a little bit roomier. I can put my luggage under the seat, the harp seat, and I have lots of room for my feet then in front of me. I would also say when you're doing that, especially if you're doing this as carry-on, my other piece of carry-on luggage, my personal item, was quite small. It was all my camera equipment, so it was pretty heavy, but it was quite small. And that's good, I think, not to bring like a big carry-on case and a harp, or if you are trying to bring the harp as carry-on rather than buying an extra seat. So that's my limited experience of flying with a harp, where it's possible but a little bit stressful. And I've read lots of posts of people talking about this and offering ideas and experiences. And I know somebody who has a Harpy who has been able to fly on Delta and putting it in the clothes closet, I guess. But again, I think you're kind of at the mercy of the people there at the time, whether they let you do that. So there's a little bit of extra stress. And so I think you have maybe 3 options of flying with a harp, and then some options that involve not flying with a harp. So if you want to fly with a harp, if it's small enough, you can bring it as a carry-on. This might depend on the airline that you're traveling on, the size. It might depend on that moment in time. And but it's potentially a nice option because then you have the harp with you at all times. Okay? You're limited to the size of the harp, but you have the harp with you. You can buy an extra seat, so potentially a great option. Of course, an extra expense. Again, I think you're kind of limited with the size of the harp. You can bring it as checked luggage. So you could potentially bring a 34-string harp as checked luggage. I know Dusty Strings has recently put out a carbon fiber travel case. It's quite expensive, I think $3,000, but that's a way to maybe safely travel. They link there on that page to some plans by Rick Kemper of how to make a travel case, a flight case for a harp, where the materials are maybe only $350, but there's quite a bit of labor involved. And if you hired somebody to do that, that could easily be $1,000, $2,000, whatever dollars. But it maybe gives you some possibilities of flying with a harp because you want something that you feel is going to be strong and secure. Of course, there's still the hassle of getting it, maneuvering through the airport with it, the stress of if you have connections, is the harp going to come with you? These days, you can maybe put a Bluetooth tracker in the case, so at least you maybe have some way of tracking it down if it gets lost somewhere. But stress for sure, but a possibility. And then, if you're not flying with the harp, you could, of course, try to transport the harp there separately. So I've done that twice in my life with a pedal harp. I've flown somewhere and trucked the harp separately. Quite expensive. There is always a chance of some damage occurring to the harp, right? Whenever it's in transit. Should be fairly safe, but it's a possibility. But yeah, quite expensive, but it is an option. Then, of course, there's considering maybe not flying, but driving or taking the train, for example, both of which make it much easier to bring a harp with you. And then finally, I think it's really worth considering the option of renting or even buying a harp where you're going. So as you think about all the potential stress and the potential cost, because even like bringing a harp as a checked bag, you're going to be paying some extra money for that. It's quite large. Buying an extra seat, and that's the stress. It makes the potential cost of a rental harp maybe look quite good, depending on where you're going, whether one is even available, how long you're going to be there, all these options, but it's worth considering. And if you're regularly travel, so I'm thinking maybe you regularly travel to visit a family member and spend, a week or 2 there or something, and are there quite regularly, if they have space for it, you could consider buying a harp and leaving it there. It's quite a large upfront cost, right? You're tying up that money in that harp. But harps tend to hold their value pretty well, so if at some point you decided to sell it, you'd probably get your money back or close to it. And obviously then you have a harp there, and maybe your family member loves that too. They get a chance to play a harp. So yeah, I think that's worth considering, some of these options that involve not trying to bring a harp with you, but getting access to a harp where you're going. And I'd love to hear your experiences. What suggestions and experiences do you have? Leave them in the comments below. And yeah, so that's my little stories and experiences of flying with a harp. And it's nice to be back home, reunited with my harps here. And I'm looking forward to bringing you a bunch more Harp Tuesday episodes. I will see you soon. Cheers.